Hey, Bassish BF for 64K and welcome to another one-off special. This one called And welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to have a look at 3 unconverted Atari 2600 games that recently got converted to the Commodore 64. So in the early 80s my dad bought us this, the Atari 2600. We played this thing to absolute death. A few years later though, we ended up getting this, and that pretty much ended my Atari 2600 days. So in 2019 we were lucky enough to get a whole slew of unconverted Activision Atari 2600 games converted to the C64 by Antonio Savona and crew. If you don't know about any of these games, please check out my video I made about it. In 2021 though, a group by the name of Alasoft has just converted 3 more Atari 2600 games to the Commodore 64. And the 3 games we're going to have a look at today are Freeway, originally released by Activision in 1981, Fast Food, released by Telesys in 1982, and finally Taz, released by Atari in 1984. So let's start checking out all these games, the original versions and the new. All 3 of these games have been converted by Nick Sherman under his Alasoft banner. He is a game developer and single-handedly ported these games himself to the C64, with more to come. Thunderground was just released as I was finishing this video, so that's available as well, and hopefully I'll feature it in an upcoming video. He is also working on a conversion of Gallagher to the C64 as well, so check him out on itch, where you can download all these games for free, and there'll be a link in the description to check them out. Now on to the first game, Freeway, released originally in 1981 by Activision on the 2600. The game was designed by one of Activision's golden boys, David Crane, who left Atari in 1979 with Alan Miller and Bob Whitehead and various other programmers to form Activision. Later, Alan and Bob would leave Activision and form Accolade. The circle was complete. David is probably best known as the designer of Pitfall and Ghostbusters, but his resume is bursting with many other gems. Freeway itself is simple. It's a 2-player versus game where you gotta see how many times you can get the chicken across the road successfully without dying. Every success adds 1 point. After the timer runs out, the chicken with the highest score wins. It's that simple. Most games of this time were still either versus games or simple score attack variety. Comparisons to Konami's Frogger are obvious, even though both games were released in 1981. The C64 version is almost exactly the same, with a few simple alterations. The biggest being the addition of an AR second player for anyone who doesn't have a second real player to go against, as the 2600 version was a 2-player game only. Nick also added a special 9th level for those skilled enough to take up the challenge. Graphically they are almost exactly the same, but sound-wise the 2600 is much better, with some unusually good car sound effects, which adds to the game quite a lot. The C64 sound effects are lacking, but doesn't really ruin the overall gameplay experience in any real way. It's very simplistic, as all these games are, but playing it in 2-player mode is definitely the way to go, and can be quite a fun experience playing it that way. Next is 1982's release of Fast Food by Telesys on the 2600. This game is another score attack affair, as you play a floating mouth that simply has to eat as much fast food thrown at you as possible, each giving a different score. You have to avoid the purple pickles, as eating 6 of these will result in a game over. The fatter you get, the faster the game becomes in classic early gaming style. This again is so simplistic that I found it to be really fun. Switch off the brain, flex those rusty old reflexes and see how far you can go. Next conversion to the C64 again is almost identical. The graphics are simple but do the job with basic sound effects. It actually plays really well and feels accurate without being too twitchy. The one major change here that Nick made was giving the really fast food that flies at you a higher score to essentially make you risk trying to get them, and therefore making the gameplay a little bit more interesting. Unlike Freeway, I'd never played this game before, but again I played it a lot longer than I thought. It's definitely something you can just slap in for 5 minutes to see how long you can last. It's good basic fun. And the last game was 1983's Taz, released by Atari on the 2600. This was a licensed game based on the Tasmanian Devil from the Warner Brothers cartoon Looney Tunes. It's basically a variation on Fast Food essentially. Taz has to eat all the food thrown at him. Eating 50 of a certain food makes it go on to the next course. You have to avoid the dynamite, which will obviously blow you up. Each course increases the speed, and again it's a simple score attack game as you try to rack up as much points as possible. If you live out
outside North America, I'm guessing due to licensing issues, this game was called Asterix, based on the Asterix and Obelix books of the same name, which I absolutely loved as a kid. It's exactly the same game with just a few simple graphical changes. The C64 version again is almost identical. Nick's major change is you only need to eat 20 of a certain food before it goes on to the next course, which makes the game move along a lot faster and makes it a little less tedious. You only have 3 lives, so you really got to avoid the dynamite, but lives can be gained with high score. It's a decent score attack game, but I honestly had a lot more fun playing Fast Food, which is the same game but just plays and flows much better. Either way, it's still a good conversion of a very basic game.
So if you never grew up with one of these, then these games are going to mean absolutely nothing to you, and that's totally fine. For me personally, it's always fun to see new games being converted to the old bread box. And if you want to experience a bunch of games from a real simpler time in gaming on your Commodore 64, then check them out. They are free, and I'll leave links in the description to download them. And that brings another episode to a close. Thanks for joining me, B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, B for 64K, and welcome to another episode of The Unconverted. So today we're going to have a look at another 3 games that never got conversions to the Commodore 64. So 2 of them are conversions of Atari 2600 games and 1 is an arcade game. And so just like the first episode, all 3 of these games were done by Arlosoft and a guy named Nick Sherman.
And the 3 games we're going to look at today are Gallagher, originally released in 1981 by Namco in the arcades, Mega Mania, released by Activision in 1982 on the Atari 2600, and Thunderground, released in 1983 by Sega, also on the 2600.
So let's start looking at all 3 of these releases, plus a brief look at the original versions.
Gallagher was originally released in the arcades in 1981 and was the sequel to Galaxian, which was, up until that point, Namco's most successful arcade game they had ever produced. It was a simple single-screen shoot-'em-up with you taking out hordes of alien bugs. The combination of extremely colorful graphics, great sound effects, and a catchy little title tune, plus the fact that the bad guys could actually steal your lives with a tractor beam, made it stand out from the already saturated single-screen blast fest that had invaded the arcades after the massive success of Space Invaders. Why the C64 never got a conversion is a bit of a mystery, especially considering it got a port of the much more obscure Gapless in 1988, which is also part of the Galaxian series. Nick based his conversion though off the NES version, which was released in 1985 and is an excellent 8-bit rendition of the arcade game. The C64 sticks pretty close to the NES incarnation, with some pretty good graphics sticking quite close to the arcade. Although the sound is not quite there, it's just a little bit off, but different sound chips could make this a pretty difficult task to replicate exactly. It plays quite well though, it moves fast and is very responsive. I like the fact that it's got the 2-player cooperative mode, which is pulled off really well, and I'd highly recommend trying that out. The game features a splash screen and bonus stages, as well as the bug's tractor beam attack, and is a nice overall version of the arcade. It's not perfect, but the C64 never had this game, and now it does. Sure, there are a lot of C64 clone games out there, but it's nice to play a version of the arcade, although still unofficial, on the old C64. Finally. Next is Mega Mania, released in 1982 by Activision on the Atari 2600. It was another in a long line of Steve Cartwright hits he did for the company, which also included Frostbite and GB Air Rally, a personal favorite of mine on the C64 and a really cool Amiga version as well. The game was another single-screen shooter affair that took most of its cues from Sega's arcade game Astro Blaster, which came out a year earlier. It's basically a clone game of that, with some differences obviously. You have to blast waves of enemies as they descend down the screen towards you in varying bizarre patterns. The game had a strange hypnotic rhythm to it, that if you could get the rhythm going, you would feel invincible, and was, for me at least, one of the coolest features of this game. It was simple and played really well, the hallmarks of the early days of Activision. Nick was actually inspired by Antonio Savona's collection of Activision conversions to the C64, and has said that this made him decide to do to Mega Mania. And yes, it's another fun port that gets lots of things right, but doesn't quite match up to the original. On the positive aspects, it gets the graphics practically exactly the same as the original, as well as adds this nifty little title loader screen. It has the options to have curved bullets, auto-fire, and such as the 2600 game. The sound effects are also quite good, but when playing both versions back to back, the 2600 sounds much chunkier and better. Gameplay feels almost the same, but I found it really hard to get that timing rhythm down. Maybe the speed is just slightly different, which ends up giving it a bit of a different feel overall. But if you've never played the original, then this is going to be quite a fun, simple blaster that you'll definitely have some fun with. But if you're a really big fan of the original, you'll definitely notice the subtle differences. Still, overall, it's another good, if slightly flawed version of the original. And the final game is called Thunderground, released by Sega in 1983 on the Atari 2600 as well. I'd always thought this game was based on an obscure Sega arcade game that I just never played, but it wasn't after all, and was specifically designed by Sega Electronics for the 2600. The game itself is a bit of a cross between Namco's Dig Dug and Atari's Combat, where you're in an underground tank burrowing your way towards a bunch of nuclear missile bases that you have to destroy before they launch. You also have to deal with the tanks guarding the bases. The levels get bigger and more elaborate as you go on, with the tanks becoming more relentless in their pursuit of destroying you. Also hidden on each level is an item that if you collect it will boost your overall score for the level. According to Nick himself, it took him about 3 days to do this conversion, which even with the game's simplicity is an impressive task to pull off. Out of his 3 conversions here, I actually enjoyed Thunderground the most. It's very accurate to the original, and the gameplay is actually quite addictive, and I came back to this game many times to see how far I could get. The controls are also spot on, with nice simple graphics and some good sound effects, making this an awesome addition to the C64 games that weren't. Overall, all these games are nice additions to the C64's library, and it's really cool to see people out there taking the time to contribute to the old breadbox's legacy. None of these games are perfect conversions, but who said they have to be? I say well done to Olasoft and everybody out there producing C64 content in any form.
And that's it for this nice little bunch of C64 conversions that we would have never seen. I'll leave a link to Olasoft's website so you can check out the games and download them. Thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time, and if you can please like and subscribe, they'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B for 64K, and welcome to another episode of The Unconverted. And today we're going to have a look at another 3 more games that never originally got conversions to the Commodore 64. And the 3 games we're going to have a look at are
Sequest, released in 1983 by Activision on the Atari 2600, Tutankham, released in 1982 by Konami in the arcades, and KC Munchkin, released on the Magnavox Odyssey 2 in 1981 and published by Philips Consumer Electronics Corporation.
So let's start having a look at all 3 games, plus a look at the original versions.
Sequest was another in a long line of popular games by game designer Steve Cartwright over at Activision. He also gave us classics on the 2600 like Frostbite and Mega Mania. Sequest was a simple game like all 2600 releases, with you manning a submarine as you try to rescue a bunch of divers. You had missiles you could blast at other subs and sharks as you picked up the divers and returned them to the surface. You also had to keep track of your oxygen, which needed to be replenished as well. Each time you surface, the game's difficulty raises slightly, so it basically encourages you to load up your sub to the max, but risk losing everyone with one dumb mistake. It's classic arcade tropes and was another popular 2600 game by Activision. The new C64 version was released in December 2021 by Haplo, who is from Sydney, Australia, and he also did the conversion to the C64 of Spatiafata, also a 2600 game by Activision. It features a nice loader screen replicating the 2600's box art, and a funky cool SID tune from Richard Bayless that just gets your toes tapping immediately. The graphics are almost the same, but the C64's color palette makes it a little bit less vibrant, but the sprites are bigger and replicated quite well. The sound effects are completely different, which is a good thing, especially for the missile firing, as I always found that on Atari to be kinda grating, although I do miss the aeroplane landing sound effect that Activision put in almost every one of their 2600 games. It's again simple fun. It plays well, and it's a nice time waster as you try to chase that score if you've got 10 minutes to spare. I still think it's super cool that almost the entire Activision 2600 back catalogue is slowly getting converted to the C64 in the last few years. Next was Tutankham, based on the 1982 arcade game by Konami and released by Stern in North America, which received a massive amount of 8-bit ports, but not one to the C64. The arcade was a multi-directional scrolling maze game where you're an adventurer looting King Tut's pyramids of all its treasure while avoiding or blasting all bats, snakes, and other creatures as you steal everything. You needed to pick up keys to open other passages and have what appears to be a laser gun which you can use to blast enemies. The trick is you can only shoot left or right, which adds a lot of strategy to the mix, especially when avoiding enemy encounters from the top or bottom. I played this as a kid in the arcade only a couple of times. I simply found the game to be way too hard, and it was definitely aimed at the veteran Robotron crowd, as opposed to the more casuals that just wanted to have some fun in the arcade gaming. This new C64 version was put together by Luca Carminati of LC Games, who also did a nice version of Bagman on the C64, which I looked at in New Retro episode number 31. This C64 version was released in February 2022 and is a brilliant interpretation of the arcade. The game is practically the same, but doesn't have that Defender-style radar system at the top of the screen, which, to be honest, was completely pointless in this game, at least I always thought. The sound effects are way better as well and far less abrasive, and thank goodness Luca omitted the footstep sounds from the arcade, which were super annoying. It moves at a really fast pace, but not as fast as the arcade, and is very responsive, and I really like the look of the graphics. It's close to the arcade, but with a nice chunky C64 flair to it. It's still a tough game though, so be warned, but it does come with selectable difficulty settings, and the game is also NTSC and PAL compatible for all C64 owners to enjoy. And as of making this, LC Games put out Tutankham Returns, a sort of C64 exclusive version made up of 7 new stages using this game's engine, so if you want more Tutankham, it's available. And the last game for today is called KC Munchkin, based on the Magnavox Odyssey 2 version, which was released way back in 1981. It was basically a clone game of Namco's Pac-Man, so much so that Atari sued, as they had the home license version of Pac-Man at the time, and Munchkin was eventually pulled off the store shelves 1 year later. So is it that much of a clone? The simple answer is yes, without a doubt, although compared to Atari's Pac-Man 2600 version, which is horribly bad on all levels, and yes, I'm saying this because I owned it as a kid, and even then I knew it was a dumpster fire. KC Munchkin was way faster and more responsive, had gameplay quirks like actually having to chase the dots, and an ever-changing random stage layout. At the end of the day though, it is Pac-Man, but still a fun variant on Namco's classic. This new C64 version was released by Pretzel Logic in May 2022. Due to KC Munchkin's legal issues, it never saw the light of day on the C64 until now, with this wonderful tribute to this fairly obscure game. This version adds a lot to the plate, with both the original Magnavox version, which is replicated almost to the T as far as graphics go, as well as an enhanced arcade version which has a C64 graphical facelift and features 96 new levels. Both versions also have a nice big bouncing SID tune accompanying the action, which adds oodles of atmosphere to the game. I had a lot of fun with this, with both versions, and all its variations in the mazes, disappearing walls, the chasing of the dot when you get down to the last one, which is very fun. And this all takes what could have been a simple Pac-Man clone and adds enough little bits of personality to make it very much worth playing on the old C64. It's fun and is definitely worth checking out.
And that's it for another great bunch of conversions to the Commodore 64. I just want to thank everybody who made these possible for all of us to enjoy. And there'll be links in the video description to download all these new games. Thanks for joining me, Bastish B, at 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of The Unconverted. And today we're going to have a look at another 3 more games that never got converted to the Commodore 64. And the 3 games we're going to have a look at are
Spatiafata, originally released on the Atari 2600 by Activision in 1982. Night Night, released in 2019 by Juan Martinez. and Space Panic, also released in 1980 by Universal in the arcades.
So let's start having a look at these games, plus a brief look at the original versions.
Spatiafata blasted its way onto the Atari 2600 in 1982 by Larry Miller, who also did Enduro for Activision. It was a single-screen shooter where you had to defend a fruit orchard from attacks by all kinds of bugs. It's a fast-paced game that gets faster with each successful round you complete, as you blast bugs and make sure they don't eat all 3 pieces of the fruit or else it's game over. It was definitely an ode to the early arcade scene at the time that was just loaded up with similar styled games. Quick arcade blasting action to rack up that score. Simple fun. The game was released in the same year as the way more successful Mega Mania, also by Activision, which basically overshadowed it, and it was quickly forgotten until now, that is, with this 2021 port to the C64 by Haplo, who also did the previous episode's game Sequest. This one starts with a nice loader screen replicating the 2600's box art, accompanied by a cool rocking tune courtesy of Richard Bayless, who also did a cool job on Haplo's other conversion, Sequest. I only wish the music was optional to be played in-game. Now that would have been excellent. Overall, it's a simple, straightforward remake that is almost identical to the 2600 version, with waves of bugs to blast and extremely fast gameplay that almost feels too fast sometimes, but is still enjoyable to chase that score and see how long you can last. This game strictly falls into the 5 minutes to spare category, and is still well worth a look to fans of classic-era Activision games. Unlike other games in the series, Night Night is a fairly new game and was originally released in 2019 by Juan Martinez on the MSX. This was the only version made, and it even got a physical release as well. It was one of those arcade-style step on all the floor tiles to color it in while avoiding a variety of enemies, then grab a key and make an exit out of the level. It's a really big 80-level arcade-style romp that features nice graphics and simple addictive gameplay, and is a lovely new addition to the MSX software library. It was designed and programmed by Juan Martinez himself, who has been slaving away over the last few years delivering quality new retro games on classic systems such as the MSX, Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, and the C64, with his Rescuing Orc being a great little C64 platform adventure game that's worth checking out. This Commodore version was converted by Aris Kavalos in 2021 and was their first ever C64 game, which is extremely impressive. It follows the plot and gameplay the same as the MSX version, with you playing Sir Bernard, who takes long dangerous walks in his castle at night to help him fall asleep as he's being cursed. It features the same addictive gameplay, where the difficulty, enemy AI, and variety get more and more interesting as the game progresses. You can also pick up items as well, such as clocks to increase your time, or a shield to protect you from at least one enemy hit. It features the same bubbly music and all the levels from the MSX original. Overall, as a first attempt C64 game, it's really damn good, and a great little arcade platformer romp to add to the C64's ever-growing library. And finally, we have Space Panic, published by Universal in 1980 in the arcades. It's considered to be the first platform game, predating Donkey Kong. Just don't break it to those Nintendo fanboys. You know they're gonna go mental over it. The game involves you as an astronaut taking out aliens on single fixed screen levels. You could climb up and down ladders, dig holes for the creatures to fall into, and then smash them in the head to finish off the job, dropping them down a level to their death. The stronger the alien, the bigger the fall needed to waste them. And that's where I guess the panic in the game's title comes from, as the game can get really intense very fast as the alien count and strength increase from level to level gets higher, requiring greater heart drops to kill them for good. The arcade game was a big hit in Japan, but failed miserably in arcades outside its native country. It was part of a long line of successful games that Kazutoshi Ueda worked on in the 1980s, which also included Mr. Do and Bomb Jack. The game only received one port outside of Japan to the ColecoVision in 1982, where again it received lukewarm results, but its effects were evident in the gaming scene, with countless clones hitting every system under the sun, including the C64 clones, Panic 64 and Panic Planet, and was no doubt the inspiration for Broderbund's computer classic Lode Runner. This new C64 release is based on the 1982 ColecoVision version, as an official Commodore version never materialized. It's almost an exact replica of that one, with simple graphics and the same sound effects. just sounding a little bit more 64-ish, of course. Gameplay is still intact and it plays quite well, running around the levels, trapping aliens and mashing on their heads. It's simple fun, and the man behind this version, Comic, is a member of HVSC, the High Voltage SID Collection website, who has been helping archive C64 SID music for everyone to enjoy. And he did a wonderful job on this simple game. And like Spatiafata, if you want a quick burst of classic arcade gaming and a taste of the platform genre's original release, then check it out.
And that's it for another great bunch of conversions to the Commodore 64. I just want to thank everybody involved for making these available for all of us to enjoy. And there'll be links in the description to download all these new games. Thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B for 64K, and welcome to another episode of The Unconverted. And welcome back. So in today's episode, we're going to have a look at 3 arcade games that never originally got conversions to the Commodore 64. And the 3 games we're going to have a look at today are:
Venture was originally released in 1981 by Exidy. Rally X was originally released by Namco in 1980. And Berserk was also released in 1980 by Stern. All 3 of these games originated in the arcades.
So let's start taking a look at all 3 games, plus a look at the original arcade versions.
Venture was released in the arcades by Exidy in 1981. Exidy themselves were founded near the start of the video arcade scene in 1973, and are probably best remembered for their controversial games such as 76's Death Race, and the poor taste that is 1986's Chiller. But between those, they put out a very unique arcade dungeon crawler styled affair that resembled an RPG of that era, but was way more in tune with Gauntlet and arcade style action tropes. Your goal was to raid 3 different dungeons and steal as much treasure as you can and escape. Each level is made up of a bunch of rooms with treasure in each, guarded by enemies. The faster you complete the level, the higher your score. You're equipped with bow and arrows to take them out. Some rooms have traps, and there's also an enemy called the Hall Monster that comes out if you take too long. He's basically immortal, so running is your only option. These guys work the same way as Evil Otto from the arcade Berserk, to panic you into dying and therefore insert another coin. It didn't look or play like anything else in the arcades at that time, and had pretty addictive gameplay despite being able to finish it pretty quickly. It only ended up receiving 3 ports, all in the early 80s, an Atari 2600 version, Intellivision version, and was a launch title for the ColecoVision, and that port is still considered the definitive home edition. In 2022, the C64 finally got a conversion, this excellent Exidy classic, courtesy of Donnie Russell. He is a self-taught C64 programmer, with the Commodore being his first computer. He got his skills started by doing magazine type-in programs, and then went on to read many books on programming and BASIC. All these skills would later be used to create this excellent version of Venture. The attention to detail here is extreme, and I love how he not only captures the looks of the arcade, but nails the gameplay spot on, with quick, fluid gameplay and a multitude of tunes replicating the sounds of the arcades and some of the home conversions. The entire arcade game is here intact for you to play, and is such a fun throwback to those early arcade days. Not only has Donnie done an excellent job with this conversion, but he has also provided the game for free, and on top of that, he's made this awesome cassette tape PDF insert that you can make your own physical copy version of the game. Like 2021, this year is giving us so many great unconverted arcade games to enjoy on our C64. And again, from myself, and I'm sure the entire Commodore community, we thank Donnie and everybody out there that are slaving away making these awesome conversions for all of us to enjoy. Thank you.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
The world's #1 selling home computer is now in a family pack, the Commodore 64, plus data cassette and joystick, 4 software programs including Introduction to Basic, a teach yourself program for the whole family. The Commodore 64 Family Pack, a value of $700 for just $499.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
Berserk was originally an arcade game released in 1980 by Stern Electronics. It was a top-down maze game where you had to blast a bunch of robots and escape each room. The game is probably best remembered for its excessive use of speech in-game by the robots, and was one of the first arcades to use this to attract players in. It only got a few ports to home systems. One of them was not the C64, although in 2013 it did get an unofficial homebrew called Berserk Redux, which I covered in episode number 11 of New Retro if you're interested. But now let's turn our attention to this new 2022 version for the Commodore 64 by Arlasoft. Berserk is another great arcade conversion by Nick Sherman of Arlasoft, who is no stranger to the Unconverted series if you've been watching it from the beginning. With Berserk Redux already existing, Nick said he had absolutely no intention of converting this, but many C64 owners wanted a little bit more accurate conversion of this arcade classic, so Nick accommodated. As good as Redux is, and it is, this new 2022 version has all the speech samples from the arcade included. This version also plays extremely well, a little bit faster and feels slightly closer to the arcade in terms of speed and rhythm, and the colors, at least for me, although not much of a difference, are a little bit more vibrant than Redux. Who thought the C64 would have two great conversions of an arcade that was never converted originally? The downside here is this version is PAL compatible only, and the quality of the speech depends on how you play the game. There is a massive difference between VAS and real hardware. It's pretty noticeable. In my opinion, playing it through VAS sounds way better. Still, overall, I think this is a great little conversion to the C64, and now you have two choices for your Berserk fix. Rally X was originally released by Namco in 1980. It was a top-down multi-directional racing game where the goal was to capture all the flags in a level while avoiding all the other races coming after you. It was extremely popular in Japan but failed financially outside of its home country, although in retrospect it's a well-loved classic. Bizarrely enough though, it got a Commodore VIC-20 release in Japan, but due to a bunch of licensing issues internationally, the C64 version was altered and renamed Radar Rat Race and was released by Commodore International and features rats in a maze instead of racing cars, where it eventually got a C64 release. So officially it never got a direct port of this arcade game, until now. In mid-2022, the C64 finally got a Rally X conversion, and not a rat version. New Rally X64 was made by Jake of The Stuff Made and is a pretty good adaptation of Namco's early 80s arcade. It kicks off with a great little splash arcade screen, and a nice jolly music adaptation by Andrew Fisher, which is a new composition that also includes odes to the original tune and is just a great starting point. The game plays pretty well as you navigate the course to collect all the flags, with great sound effects and another cool version of the arcade's repetitive but addictive main tune. The PAL version of this game runs a bit slower than the arcade. It's pretty noticeable, but it's not game-breaking by any means. But if you're a hardcore fan, fortunately it's also playable on NTSC systems, and Jake has stated that that's the way it should be played, as the speed matches the arcade pretty accurately. The graphics are simple but do a great job of replicating the arcade while still looking very C64-ish. And it's a fun little game to put on for 5 minutes to mess around with, just like the arcade. And it is really great to see this classic finally on the breadbox once and for all.
And thanks again, as usual, for everybody that helped bring these games to the Commodore 64. All of us really appreciate it. And I'll leave links in the description to download all these games. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can please like and subscribe, they'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.